The stable-yard at Ashwick Park held its breath before dawn, the way a house holds its breath when it has forgotten its own name. He was already at work when she crossed the yard with the child. He heard them before he saw them, the governess's measured step and the child's smaller one skipping to catch it, and he kept his back to the gate because he had learned, in 3 months of working the stables of his own estate, that looking up was the one luxury he could not afford. He drove the currycomb along the mare's flank in long, deliberate strokes. Steam rose from the horse's coat into the cold morning air. He did not look up. "Mr. Barton," the child said, because she always said his name first, as a kind of greeting, the way children do when a name has become a pleasure to them. He turned then, because the child had to be answered. She stood at the gate with her mittens on and her bonnet not yet tied, the ribbons dangling, and beside her stood Miss Marlowe with the bonnet strings in her hand, which meant the child had made her usual escape before dressing was complete. Miss Marlowe was watching him the way she always watched him, with a slight crease between her brows that was not disapproval, but something older than disapproval. Something like the effort of remembering. "Miss Phoebe," he said, "you have escaped again. I came to see the new foal." She pressed her face between the gate's iron bars and looked past him. "Is she brown?" "Bay," he said. "Bay with a white star." The child made a sound of satisfied wonder. Miss Marlowe's hands were still on the bonnet strings. He did not look at her directly. He had learned not to look directly at Cecily Marlowe, because looking directly at her required a kind of composure he was not yet sure he had, and because she was one of 3 people on this estate who might, if she looked long enough, remember who he actually was. "We should not keep Mr. Barton from his work," Miss Marlowe said, and her voice was precisely what he had come to expect, careful and warm and carrying, like water over clean stone. She was speaking to the child. She was not speaking to him. And yet he felt the sentence land the way sentences land when they are aimed with more precision than they admit. "You may see her another day," she added, "when she is less new to the world and more accustomed to visitors." She began to tie the bonnet strings. The child submitted with the patience of someone who knew protest was useless. Miss Marlowe glanced up once, briefly, the crease between her brows returning, and then she guided the child back toward the house. He watched them go. He could not help it. Then he turned back to the mare and put the currycomb to her flank and worked in silence while the yard filled slowly with morning light and the sound of the estate waking around him. The estate. His estate. The yard where he had learned to ride on a temperamental gray pony named Ptolemy, whose grave was still visible at the field's far edge under a hawthorn tree. His father had let him name it. Edmund had laughed and said it was the most impractical name ever given to a horse, and Thomas had said that horses lived longer with names that suited them, and Edmund had said Thomas had inherited their father's gift for reasoning that was entirely correct and entirely useless, and they had both laughed, and it had been a good morning. That had been 19 years ago. Edmund was 2 years in his own grave. Their father was 4 years in his. And the man who now called himself Viscount Ashwick had never once set foot in the stable-yard, because Randolph Wyvern had never cared for horses. Thomas Ashwick had come home from Waterloo in September of 1815, 8 months after the battle, delayed first by a musket ball in his left shoulder, and then by a slow fever in a military hospital in Brussels, and then by the particular cruelty of the Channel crossing in winter. He had been reported dead. His papers had been lost when the horse he was riding broke its leg and had to be destroyed, and the dispatch bag it carried went with it into the ditch. By the time Thomas reached London, his name had already been given away. Not deliberately. He had tried to understand that. The succession had moved the way succession moved when no one was looking for a secondary heir. Edmund had died of a fever in December of 1814, leaving the title and the estate in a holding arrangement managed by the family's solicitor in Bath. Thomas, reported killed, had no legal claim that anyone was holding open, and Randolph, who was a cousin of the third degree, technically within the line, plausibly within reason, and possessed of a solicitor's confidence and a dead man's name to fill, had stepped into the vacancy before anyone thought to check whether the vacancy was real. By the time Thomas arrived at the door of the Bath solicitor's offices in November of 1815, Randolph Wyvern had already been recognized as Viscount Ashwick for 6 months. He had the papers. He had the county's acknowledgement. He had the house. The solicitor in Bath, a cautious man named Greer, had listened to Thomas's account with the particular blankness of someone who has already decided on his answer and is waiting for the other man to finish speaking. He had said, with precise regret, that the matter of succession was settled and that any challenge would require proofs Thomas did not currently possess. He had said that a man who could not produce his own military records, his own baptismal entry, or a witness of sufficient standing, would find the courts a difficult avenue. He had said that it grieved him. He had not looked grieved. What Thomas needed was the baptismal register from the parish church of St. Cuthbert's at Chetworth, 6 miles from Ashwick Park. The original, which his father had always kept in the library alongside the family's other documents of legal weight, was somewhere inside a house Thomas was no longer permitted to enter. And so he had done the only thing that remained to him. He had taken a room in the village under the name Barton. He had applied for work at the estate's stables, and he had waited while the man who had stolen his name rode out every morning on horses Thomas's father had bought and trained and loved, and came home every evening to a house Thomas's father had built. The head groom, a sour man named Fenn, who had been with the estate since the old Viscount's time, had called him a ghost within the first week. Not to his face. Fenn had said it to the undergroom the morning after Thomas asked to be put on the Black Gelding's training rotation because only a man who knew horses the way a gentleman knew them would have asked for that particular task, and Fenn was not a fool. "Some dead man's ghost," Fenn had said, wiping his hands on his work apron and looking sideways at Thomas's back. "Wandered in out of the cold and thinks he knows my yard." The undergroom had laughed. Thomas had heard it through the open stall gate and had gone on with his work. If you are still with me in this story, you may already understand what kind of patience this requires. Not the patience of someone who has given up. The patience of someone who is waiting for the exact right moment. The way a man waits for the tide. Miss Cecily Marlowe had arrived at Ashwick Park 4 months before Thomas, summoned from the village of Nether Westing by a notice in the Bath papers seeking a governess for the ward of the new Viscount Ashwick. She had not known, when she accepted the position, that the estate was the same one she had grown up on the periphery of. Her father, Martin Marlowe, had been the Ashwick land steward for 20 years. She had spent her childhood in the estate's lower rooms, carrying ledgers, watching her father move through the house with the careful deference of a man who understood exactly which rooms were his to occupy and which were not. Her father had died in the spring of 1815, before Edmund's death and before the succession passed to Randolph. He had died believing Ashwick Park was in capable and legitimate hands. He had died not knowing that 6 months later the name above the door would belong to a man who had not earned it. Cecily had not known either, for some time. When she understood what Randolph Wyvern was, she also understood what she had already promised him in the form of a signed employment contract for 12 months, and she had made the calculation her father would have recognized, and so she stayed, because Phoebe needed her, and because leaving would accomplish nothing except her own comfort, and she had long ago stopped treating her own comfort as a consideration of the first order. She was good with the child. Phoebe was 7 and had been a ward of the Ashwick estate since infancy, the daughter of a deceased officer in Edmund's regiment, a small obligation Edmund had taken seriously, and she trusted Cecily with the uncomplicated fidelity of a child who has not yet learned that trust is a thing to be distributed carefully. Cecily repaid this trust in kind, and the arrangement between them had the warmth and the slight formality of two people who have chosen each other inside a situation neither of them chose. It was on account of Phoebe that Cecily began to notice the stable hand who called himself Barton. The child had decided, with the absolutism of the very young, that Mr. Barton was her particular friend. She said he was the only person in the whole of Ashwick Park who answered her questions as though the questions were worth answering. He told her the names of the horses and the names of the stars they were named for. He told her how to carry an apple flat on her palm, so a horse would not mistake her fingers for part of the offering. He told her about the foal's birth with the same gravity he used for everything, and Phoebe received this gravity as the mark of a man who was serious about the things that mattered. Cecily observed all of this from a slight distance, and she observed something else. That Mr. Barton moved through the stable yard the way a man moves when the place he is in is familiar to him in his bones, not because he has worked there, but because he has lived somewhere nearby for a very long time. She had grown up watching her father move through Ashwick Park with a steward's precise knowledge of where everything was and why. Barton moved like that. He moved like a man who knew not just the yard, but the house beyond the yard, the fields beyond the house, the shape of the land in winter. She told herself she was imagining this. She filed the observation away in the category of things that required more information before a conclusion could be drawn, and she went back to Phoebe's French irregular verbs and the problem of the child's inability to remember that the past imperfect was not optional. It was a Thursday in February, the sky the color of pewter and the yard holding half an inch of new snow, when she climbed to the hayloft above the stable with Phoebe's slate to retrieve a book the child had left there the day before. Phoebe had a habit of conducting her lessons in impractical places when Cecily was not watching closely enough. She was on her knees in the corner of the loft with the slate under her arm, and the book found, preparing to descend, when she heard the outer stable door open below her. She recognized the solicitor Greer's voice first. He was a city man, his vowels flattened and precise, and he came to the estate twice a month, and always left looking as though he had accomplished something he did not intend to discuss. "You have been here long enough," Greer said. "His lordship is prepared to be generous. £100, payable in coin, and you remove yourself from this county before the week is out." There was a silence. Then, "No." One word. Barton's voice. Quiet. The way his voice was always quiet, carrying the particular weight of a man who has already thought through everything that could follow, and is not afraid of any of it. "You must understand," Greer said, with the patient condescension of a man who believes money resolves everything, "that your continued presence here creates a difficulty. His lordship does not want difficulty. He is prepared to compensate you for the inconvenience of relocation." "His lordship," Barton said, "may keep his £100. You are being unwise." "I am being accurate," Barton said. "There is a difference. Go and tell him what I said." The silence that followed was a different kind. Cecily did not move. She heard Greer's footsteps on the stable floor, deliberate and cold, and then the outer door again, and then nothing but the sound of the horses and the wind at the loft's single high window. She stayed where she was for a long time after that. The book was in her hands. She had stopped thinking about French irregular verbs entirely. Cecily did not go to him that day. She went the next morning, crossing the yard before Phoebe was awake, in the gray early light when the house was still quiet, and she found him in the tack room oiling a bridle with the focused patience of a man who had been waiting. "I was in the loft," she said. "Yesterday." He did not pretend not to understand her. That was the first thing she noticed. He did not reach for the performance of confusion. He simply set the bridle down and looked at her steadily with dark eyes that she had been trying not to look at directly for 3 months because they held something that the name Barton and the work of a stable hand did not explain. "I know," he said. "Then you know I heard what was offered." "And what was refused," he said. She folded her hands in front of her with the particular composure her father had given her, the kind that was not coldness but structure, the way a stone wall is not coldness but structure. "I think," she said, "that you should tell me who you are, not the name you have been using." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the bridle on the bench and then at her, and she had the distinct impression that he was weighing something not about whether to tell her, but about whether she was ready for it. "My name," he said, "is Thomas Ashwick. The late Viscount Ashwick was my father. Edmund, who died in December of 1814, was my elder brother." The tack room held the smell of leather and oil and cold stone. Cecily did not move. She let the name settle the way snow settles, not loudly, but completely. "You were reported killed," she said. "I was not killed." "I know that," she said. "You are standing in front of me." She paused. "I remember you. Not well. I was a child, and I remember a boy who gave the stable cats names." Something shifted in his face at that. He did not look away, but something loosened, the small, involuntary crack of a man who has been holding himself very carefully for a very long time, and has just been reminded that someone remembers him before the holding was necessary. "Ptolemy and Copernicus," he said, "and the small gray one we called Erasmus. And the runt," she said, "which my father said was bad luck to name, and you named it anyway. Fortuna," he said, "she lived 7 years. If the weight of 2 years of silence and a stolen name and a dead brother had a sound, it might have sounded like that word. Fortuna. Small and specific and irretrievable, the way the past always is." She asked him then about the evidence he needed, and he told her about the baptismal register at St. Cuthbert's, and he told her about the letter he had written 6 weeks ago to his father's sister, Lady Corwin, who had retired to a house in Bath after his father's death. He had not yet received her reply. He did not know if she believed him. He did not know if she had even read it. And then, because she had asked him to tell her the truth and he had done so, he told her the rest. The quarrel with Edmund, the months in Brussels, the letter he had never written. He told it in the voice of a man delivering a legal account of his own failings, precise and without self-pity, and she understood that he had not told this to anyone since he came home, because there had been no one to tell it to. She did not offer him absolution. She was not his confessor, and she understood that absolution was not what he had asked for. What he had asked for, in telling her, was only to be heard. "My father believed the succession was legitimate," she said, when he was done. "He died thinking Randolph Wyvern was the rightful heir." "I know," Thomas said. "He would not have been complicit," she said. "He would not have known." "I know that, too," he said. "He was a good man, Miss Marlowe. I remember him." The crease between her brows returned, and this time it was not the effort of remembering, but the effort of holding steady against something that did not want to be held. She succeeded. Her father had given her that too, along with the composure. She thought of something her father had said in the last year of his life, when she had asked him once whether he ever resented the work of service, the careful navigation of which rooms were his to occupy and which were not. He had considered the question with the same deliberate honesty he gave to everything. And he had said, "The question is not which rooms belong to you, Cecily. The question is whether you carry yourself correctly in all of them." She looked at Thomas Ashwick, who had been carrying himself correctly for 3 months in a room that had once been entirely his, and she made a decision. "Tell me what needs to be done," she said. What she did was small and specific and precise. She had access to the house's interior that Thomas did not. She had Greer's schedule, which she had memorized because Greer frightened Phoebe, and she had learned to keep the child away from the front hall on his visiting days. She knew which drawer of the library desk held the correspondence Randolph considered important, because she had seen him go to it once and fail to close it quietly. And she had noted the detail the way her father had taught her to note details, without urgency, without announcement, and without ever going back to look again until the time was right. She found what she needed on a Thursday afternoon while Randolph was writing and Phoebe was asleep. A single letter, folded and sealed with a private mark, from Greer to Randolph, dated 2 months prior. She did not take it. She read it, in the library that had once belonged to Thomas Ashwick's father, standing at the desk where his father had signed the documents of the estate's management. Then she refolded it, returned it to the drawer, and walked out of the library at her ordinary pace. She told Thomas that evening, through the gap in the yard gate, in 4 sentences, keeping her voice entirely even. What Greer's letter confirmed was that Randolph had known since December of 1815, when a letter arrived from the military hospital in Brussels, that Thomas was alive. He had suppressed it. He had paid Greer to manage the information. Thomas listened to all 4 sentences without speaking. When she was done, he said, "Lady Corwin will have received my letter by now." "Yes," she said. "If she comes," he said, "it will be enough." What they had not counted on was that Randolph was listening. He had not intended to listen. He had come in early from his ride, the weather turning, and he had crossed through the house's back passage instead of the main hall and had passed the corridor window that looked out on the yard gate, and he had seen them, his governess and his stable hand, standing at the gate in the cold, speaking in low voices with the careful familiarity of 2 people who have become allies in something he had not authorized. Randolph Wyvern was not a stupid man. This was the difficulty with him. He had built his position from intelligence and patience, and a solicitor's gift for understanding which document mattered and which did not. And in the 2 years he had held the name Viscount Ashwick, he had learned to read a room the way a navigator reads water, watching for the current that was not where it should be. He sent for Greer the following morning, and the morning after that, which was a Saturday in late February. He called the household together. It was not unusual for a house's domestic staff to be assembled. A departure, an announcement, a change in the management of the estate. What was unusual was that Randolph had also invited 3 neighbors, gentlemen of the county, and Lady Henrietta Blythe, who arrived in a carriage from her estate at Warsham with her personal maid, and the particular expression of a woman who had been told she might witness something interesting. They stood in the entrance hall. Greer was at Randolph's right hand. Cecily was at the back of the room with Phoebe beside her, the child's hand in hers. Randolph said he had a matter of some importance to address. He said that a man had presented himself in the county, making claims of a sensitive and troubling nature, claims about identity, about succession, about the legitimacy of the current holder of the Ashwick name. He said this man had been employed in the estate's stables under a false identity. He said this was not the behavior of a man with a legitimate grievance. He said it was the behavior of a man either deranged or criminal, and that either way the patience of the estate's household had been extended long enough. Thomas Ashwick was brought in by 2 of Randolph's footmen. He had not resisted. He walked between them with the particular stillness of a man who understands that the dignity of his bearing is the only argument available to him in this room. And he made the argument well. His coat was a stable hand's coat. His hands were a working man's hands. He stood in the entrance hall of his father's house, and he looked at Randolph Wyvern with a steadiness that was not defiance, but something colder and more patient than defiance. "This man," Randolph said to the room, "has been calling himself Thomas Ashwick. He has been spreading this claim to the county's credulous parties. He is, as anyone who knew Thomas Ashwick can confirm, nothing of the kind. Thomas Ashwick died at Waterloo." He paused. "He is a ghost and a fiction, and we have been patient with him long enough." Lady Henrietta Blythe said, from her position by the window, in a voice that carried the easy confidence of a woman who had never been required to doubt her own observations, "The poor creature! A dead man's ghost, haunting stables. It is almost pitiable." The dismissive label landed in the room the way these things land, not loudly, but with the satisfaction of consensus. Several of the assembled staff looked at Thomas with the expression people wear when a difficult thing has been named, and they are relieved to agree with the naming. Greer looked at the floor. Cecily looked at Thomas. He was looking at Randolph. He had not looked at her since he entered the room. She understood, with a chill that was not cold but clarity, that he did not intend to argue his case here. He was waiting for something she did not know about. He was standing in the entrance hall of his father's house, with his father's country outside the window, and the brass compass she did not yet know about pressing against his ribs through the coat's inner pocket. And he was waiting with the patience of a man who has already sent the letter that will resolve everything, and who knows only that it has not yet arrived. "You will leave this estate," Randolph said, "today. Greer has arranged the transport. You will not return. If you do, the magistrate has been informed." Thomas said nothing for a moment. The room waited. "Very well," he said, and they walked him out. Cecily stood in the entrance hall after the staff dispersed, Phoebe's hand still in hers, the child pressing close because children know when a room has done something unkind, even if they cannot name what. She looked at the front door, which had closed behind Thomas Ashwick, and she felt a fury that was entirely quiet, the kind of fury that does not express itself in a room, but waits. She waited 3 days. She did not know what she was waiting for. She kept Phoebe's lessons running, the French irregular verbs and the geography and the morning arithmetic, and she answered Randolph's household questions with the same measured competence she always brought to them, and she watched the front drive from Phoebe's schoolroom window with a patience she had inherited from a man who had spent 20 years knowing which rooms were his and carrying himself correctly in all of them. On the 4th day, in the afternoon, a carriage came up the front drive. It was not a hired carriage. It was the kind of carriage that belongs to a woman who has been traveling in considerable haste and has not bothered to change her clothes for the last stage of the journey, which meant the woman inside it had arrived as quickly as the roads permitted. It was the color of a storm cloud, and it bore the crest of the Corwin family, and it had hardly stopped before the door opened and a woman of 60 descended without waiting for the footman's assistance. She was tall and thin, with iron-gray hair, and the expression of someone who has been holding a very particular anger in place for 4 days and has arrived at the point where it no longer needs to be held. Cecily had not known she was coming. Thomas had not known she was coming. Lady Corwin had made this decision on her own. Behind her, Thomas Ashwick stepped down from the carriage. He had, Cecily noted from the schoolroom window above, changed his coat. She sent Phoebe to her room to draw, and she went downstairs. The entrance hall, which had been the site of a man's public removal 4 days ago, filled again. Randolph came from his study with Greer 2 steps behind him. Lady Henrietta Blythe, who had stayed on at Randolph's invitation in the expectation of an engagement announcement, emerged from the drawing room in a gown that had been chosen for being seen. The senior footman, who was not certain what was happening, but understood that his presence was appropriate, stationed himself by the door. Lady Corwin did not wait for Randolph to begin. She was not the kind of woman who waited for rooms to settle before she spoke. She had been the youngest and most decided of the late Viscount's siblings, and she had spent 40 years making it clear that the family's caution was not hers. She held a book in her hands, not a large book, small and worn, with a cover the color of old oak. The baptismal register of St. Cuthbert's, Chetworth, covering the years 1780 through 1802, which had been in the church's vestry for 30 years, and which she had retrieved 2 days ago with the vicar's bewildered assistance. "This man," she said, and her voice carried into every corner of the hall. "This man is Thomas Ashwick, Viscount Ashwick. I knew his father." 8 words. They were not the calibrated line of a courtroom. They were the declaration of a woman who had known a family for 40 years and was not prepared to watch it be erased. They landed in the hall the way a stone lands in still water, the immediate impact, and then the rings moving outward. Randolph said, "Lady Corwin, I must ask you to consider what you are doing. The succession was legally established by Greer," she said. "Yes, I have read Greer's letters. The one from November of 1815 in particular is very illuminating, Mr. Greer." She did not look at Greer when she said this. She looked at Randolph. "My nephew wrote to me in January. I have his letter. I have the baptismal register. And I have, waiting outside in my carriage, the army surgeon who attended Thomas Ashwick in Brussels and is prepared to state in any court in England what he knows of the patient's identity, his injuries, and the particular circumstance of the missing dispatch bag." Lady Henrietta Blythe had gone very still by the drawing-room door. She looked at Randolph with the expression of a woman rapidly recalculating an investment. Greer looked at the floor. Randolph looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at him, not with triumph, which would have been wrong, but with the same patient steadiness he had worn in this hall 4 days ago, standing in a stable hand's coat, and the silence of a man who knows who he is, and has always known it, and has been waiting for the room to catch up. "The magistrate will be called," Lady Corwin said, "and the Bath solicitors will be contacted, and the register will be lodged with the court. This can proceed as a legal matter, or it can proceed as a family matter. I have a strong preference for the latter, which is faster and produces fewer newspaper notices. I imagine you share that preference." Randolph Wyvern stood in the entrance hall of a house that had never been his, and the social world he had built in 2 years stood around him in the persons of Lady Henrietta and his senior footman and Greer, with his eyes on the floor, and he understood, in the particular way that intelligent men understand things they have refused to understand for years, that the morning after a claim collapses looks the same as any other morning, except that it is morning on the other side of everything. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I will speak to my solicitors." Lady Corwin said, "Yes, you will." It took 6 weeks. The legal procedures required by the transfer of a title and an estate are not rapid, which is by design. A society's architecture for exactly this kind of thing reflects its understanding that the stakes are high enough to require patience. Cecily remained at Ashwick Park through the 6 weeks, because Phoebe needed her continuity, and because she had not yet been given a reason to leave, and she watched the house rearrange itself around a center of gravity that had always been there, and was only now visible. Thomas Ashwick did not move back into the house immediately. He stayed in the village. He came to the estate on business, and he dealt with the solicitors and the magistrate and the army surgeon with the same quiet precision he had brought to currying horses in November, which was to say, with the patience of a man who understands that the important thing is to complete the task accurately and not to perform the completing of it for an audience. He came to the stable yard once on a cold Tuesday morning, and Cecily happened to be crossing with Phoebe, who was supposed to be inside doing her geography. The child saw him before Cecily did and made her usual escape, running ahead to the gate. "Mr. Barton," Phoebe said, and then corrected herself immediately, with the seriousness of a child who has been told something important and wants to demonstrate that she has retained it. "I mean, your lordship." "Either will do," Thomas said. He looked past the child to Cecily, and the crease between her brows was there again, which he had come to understand was not reluctance, but a kind of translation work she did on herself before she allowed what she felt to become visible. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "My lord," she said. They stood in the yard gate while Phoebe observed them with the attentiveness of a child who has decided that something interesting is happening. He said, "I have been told that you found the letter, Greer's letter to Randolph." "I did not take it," she said. "No," he said, "but you remembered it." "My father taught me to remember useful things," she said. "He taught you several things of value," Thomas said, and the specificity of this, that he was not paying her a general compliment, but naming a specific inherited quality he had observed, landed in her chest in a way that was not convenient and not unwelcome. Phoebe said, "Are you going to live in the house now?" "Eventually," he said. "Will you still come to the yard?" "Yes," he said. "The horses need to be seen to." "Mr. Barton always came to the yard," Phoebe said, with the satisfied logic of the very young, as though this settled the question of continuity entirely. Cecily looked at her hands, which were folded in front of her, with the careful composure that was her inheritance. She looked at them for a moment, and then she looked up at Thomas Ashwick, who had been watching her with the patience he brought to everything. The patience that she had understood over the past months was not coldness, but its precise opposite. The patience of a man who has learned that the things worth having are worth the time they take. "I shall need to find a new position," she said, "once the household is settled." "You could," he said. "Phoebe will need a governess," she said, "for several more years." "She will," he said. "I imagine the new household will want a reference," she said, "for whoever takes the post." "I imagine," he said, "that the new household might prefer not to change governesses at all, if the governess in question were persuadable." Phoebe, who was listening to this exchange with the full attention of a child who understands that adults say the important things in the voice they use when they think children are not paying attention, looked from one to the other with the expression of someone who has just understood a joke told in a language she was told she did not yet speak. "Miss Marlowe," she said helpfully, "I would prefer not to have a different governess." "Thank you, Phoebe," Cecily said, with the composed warmth she reserved for the moments when the child had done something she could not thank her properly for in front of an audience. Thomas Ashwick looked at Cecily Marlowe in the gate of his own stable yard, and the morning light was the light that had always fallen on this yard in February. The particular quality of winter sun on gray stone, and she felt her hands loosen from their careful fold, very slightly, in a way she was not sure he saw. He saw. "Miss Marlowe," he said, and it was the first time he had said her Christian name in the syllable's full sound, Cecily, using the name her father had chosen for her and her father alone had used without ceremony. "I have not had the opportunity to thank you for what you did. Not adequately." "You do not owe me thanks," she said. "You owe me nothing." "I know," he said. "That was not what I said." The ward in question pressed herself between them through the gate with the efficiency of a small person who has decided a conversation needs a mediator, and Thomas Ashwick put a hand briefly on Phoebe's head, and the gesture had in it such a quantity of undemonstrated tenderness, steady, warm, unannounced, that Cecily Marlowe felt something in her chest shift with a finalness that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the simple fact of recognizing someone who had been recognizing her for months. If this is the moment you have been waiting for, you are not wrong to have waited. Some recognitions are not quick. The best ones rarely are. The spring came in slowly that year, the way springs come in after difficult winters. The estate's fields were replanted under Thomas's direction, which was in practice a restoration of his father's rotation. Cecily knew this because her father's ledgers had included the field plans, and she had grown up memorizing them the way she memorized French verbs. Not because anyone asked her to, but because they were there, and she did not see the point of leaving a thing unlearned. She and Thomas walked the lower fields twice in April, Phoebe running ahead identifying wildflowers with the energy of a child who has been given a wildflower identification book and considers it a commission, and Cecily told Thomas what her father had recorded about the soil on the east slope and the drainage problem at the river's edge that had been addressed in 1808 with a small channel that might need to be cleared. Thomas listened with his hands behind his back, walking beside her at the distance propriety required, which was not very far, and he asked her questions that were genuine questions, and she answered them with the information her father had left her. "You carry a great deal of him," Thomas said once. "He was worth carrying," she said. He did not offer sympathy, which she had not asked for. He simply walked beside her in the morning that was becoming warm, and the child found a yellow flower she insisted was named something Cecily was fairly sure was not its actual name, and they told her she was correct because she was 7, and the flower was yellow, and some corrections can wait for another day. He asked her to marry him in the library, in the evening, in May, when Phoebe was asleep and the house was quiet. He asked without ceremony, because ceremony would have been wrong for both of them. Wrong for the man who had spent 3 months in his own stable yard, and wrong for the woman who had never treated the formal version of anything as the truest version. He stood by the window, with the garden visible behind him, and he said that he had been considering the question since January, and he wanted her opinion of it. She said, in the voice she reserved for opinions she held with complete conviction, that her opinion was in favor. He stepped closer to her, which was not a great distance since the library was not a large room, and they were already standing close enough that she was aware of the exact quality of warmth he gave off, and the exact sound of his breathing when it changed, as it changed now. He put his hand over hers, where she had set it on the desk's edge, and the touch was deliberate and still, the hand of a man who is not reaching or rushing, but simply placing himself where he has decided to be, permanently, with his full weight. She turned her hand under his and held it. There was a small sound from the pocket of his coat, which was the brass compass shifting as he moved. She did not know yet what it was. He would tell her, later, about Edmund, and about the compass. And she would hold that story the way she held everything he gave her, carefully and completely, and without making him feel that it was a weight. Because it was not a weight, it was a life, and lives are not weights when you have chosen to carry them. That night, the library was lit by a single lamp on the desk, and the last of the garden's light fading outside the window. The house around them was quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when they have been properly inhabited, not empty, but resting. Thomas Ashwick stood in the library of his father's house with Cecily Marlowe's hand in his, and the evening settled around them, and the brass compass was warm in his pocket, and outside the window the fields that were his father's and Edmund's and his own lay in the long light of a May evening, very green, very still. He opened the compass on the desk between them. Its needle swung north, as it always had, as it had in Edmund's hand, and in their father's hand before that, as it would in the years to come, steady as anything that knows its own direction. She looked at it for a moment, the small brass instrument open on the desk of the library that was now his and would be hers. And then she looked up at him, and he was already looking at her. And neither of them spoke, because neither of them needed to. Thank you for staying with Thomas and Cecily until the end. If their patience moved you, leave a word below. It is a quiet story about knowing who you are while the world insists otherwise, and it is glad you were here for it.